Okay, let's talk a bit about writing APA formatted papers. If you're needing more information, more details, more review of this, head to your APA manual. Specifically, Chapter 2 covers all the different sections of an APA formatted paper, including information about the formatting details and also content, like what's supposed to go in each section. I would strongly recommend outlining each section if you're having a hard time organizing your thoughts or you're having a hard time getting a start. Instead of worrying about the exact right words for each section, I'd outline your major points. I find it a really useful tool, especially when it comes to the introduction section. The major components of an APA formatted paper are listed here, going in order, starting with a title page. Everybody's first page of the paper is going to be a title page. You know, title page is page 1. The abstract is on its own page, so the abstract page is always going to be page 2. The introduction starts the body of the paper, and that's always going to start on page 3. The rest of it, though, how long it is, kind of depends on how long each of your sections are. Typically, the introduction is the longest section of a paper. It doesn't have to be, but it usually is. Typically, the discussion section is going to be the next longest, unless you have a really complicated method. Method is usually the third longest, but if it's a more complicated study, that might be equal to or even a little longer than the discussion. And then finally, the results section is typically the shortest part of the paper. It's not unusual to have a results section that's just a single page, in fact. Some of these things are going to be optional. You're not always going to have an appendix. You won't always have an author's note. You may or may not have tables or figures, although we're going to typically require at least one figure because you'll graph your results. There is a sample paper in Blackboard. This is a correctly formatted, APA formatted paper. I would strongly recommend making a hard copy of it and laying it out next to your own paper or laying it next to your computer screen as you're doing a review of your paper to help spot formatting errors. It can help a little with content, but I think the thing is more useful for showing you what should be in bold, what should be in italics, what should be indented or not indented, that sort of thing. What needs to go on its own first page, what can kind of bleed over from one page to the other. When it comes to grading, I'm going to be merciless on this. My expectation is you are going to use these sorts of tools to your advantage. Don't get these formatting errors, or don't make these formatting errors, right? Kind of get the formatting down. Let's talk a little bit about the introduction. Typically, the intro is the longest section. I'm going to say it's typically the longest to write and often kind of the hardest to write because you really are telling a story here. Your introduction should start off quite broad and then narrowing to a specific focus, leading to a logical experimental question and design. So by the time I'm getting to the end of your introduction in your paper, I, as the reader, should be able to guess what you're studying, what are your major variables you're interested in. I probably have a guess even as to how you would study it, and I should have a pretty good guess as to what your theories and predictions are before you even tell me them. That's because you've painted such a clear, logical story describing previous research in this field. We typically use what's called a Christmas tree layout, meaning each section of your paper goes from broader to narrower, one at a time. For example, let's imagine that I wanted to study the effects of lighting and music type on memory. So I'm going to have my participants either study in bright light or dim light, and I'm going to have them either listen to, classical or jazz music while they're studying, and then they take a test, right? I could tell this story in a few different ways. I'm probably going to start with whatever I am most drawn to, most interested in. What's the reason I'm doing this study? And maybe it's memory. Maybe I'm just really interested in factors that are going to impact our ability to learn and remember information. So I'm going to start broadly with a topic like memory. What do we know about memory? Why is memory important? How do we improve our memories? Why does it even matter if we improve our memories? How much, I don't know, something like how much time we spend learning material in our lifetimes. Who knows what I'm going to find in that previous research. But I want to make the case that memory matters, memory is important, and it's a good idea to understand what kind of factors can help or hinder our creation of new memories, right? Things that are going to help us or hinder us from learning. Notice this is pretty broad, right? What impacts memory? But I'm working to my variables. I said one of my variables is lighting. So maybe then I have another section of probably multiple paragraphs on lighting. What kinds of previous research has been done on how lighting impacts us unrelated to memory? We start really broad, right? Like maybe we have research that says lighting can impact mood. Maybe we have some other research that says lighting can impact eating and drinking. Actually, I know there is some research that says that. Maybe we have some research that says the color of the lighting in a room impacts how hard someone can do a workout, right? We're starting with things that are broader. They're less related to our particular study, but they relate to lighting. So we're telling the story that lighting can impact all sorts of areas of our life. Lighting can also affect things like memory and performance on memory tests. So now we're narrowing down our topic, right? Just like our Christmas tree narrows as we're getting towards the top. It's really an upside down Christmas tree we're probably doing here. But anyway, we're now going to talk about research specifically relating to lighting and memory. But our study is not just on lighting and memory, it's also on music type. So we're going to go broad again when we say, well, look, but lighting's not the only thing that could influence memory. Another factor that might be important in understanding memory is music. Now we broaden back out. What is music? Why do we care about music? The fact is, a lot of us spend a lot of time listening to music. Well, how come? Maybe because music can influence mood, right? Music can influence, I don't know, whatever else we can find that it influences. Maybe it improves sleep. Maybe it decreases heart rate. Whatever. Again, we're painting a broader picture that music can influence us in many ways. But we're narrowing down to previous research on how music type impacts our ability to study or our ability to do well on a test. You're narrowing it towards what you're studying. If you've given me this background, I'm going to guess that your study has something to do with memory, has something to do with lighting, and has something to do with music. And specifically, how things like lighting and music can influence study habits, because you've told me it's about studying, right? We just keep narrowing down towards our particular research topic, our particular theories of how the world works, and our particular predictions. Your introduction, in addition to going from broad to narrow, you need to make sure that every time you make a fact-based statement, it is supported by a citation to a reference. Those references need to be clear and uniform so anyone can look them up. They can look up those facts for themselves. That's why we have that APA formatting for those in-text citations, right? Making it easy. We all follow the same rules. We can all find those references. Include all relevant background research you've done and skip the irrelevant stuff. It's possible you've read some papers that in the end just aren't as relevant to your research as you thought they might be at the beginning. Great, skip them. They don't belong in your paper, right? There are some other places references could go. We potentially would make use of a reference in our method section. For example, if we used somebody else's survey, we will cite them. You can even sometimes, I think a good paper often will include a couple citations in the discussion section, especially if things didn't work out quite the way you predicted when you started this research. Well, then go to the literature and see if anyone else had similar findings to your surprise finding that you found, right? To help explain what you did see. So you might have some references in those sections of your paper, but most of it's going to come here. Carefully, as you're starting to pull this paper together, evaluate your background literature materials. Go to the list of points you wanted to include that help lead up to your predictions. How do your literature searches support this, right? It doesn't include every paper you've read, but you need to make a case for whatever it is you're predicting about how your research is going to turn out. You need to make a case for all your theories about how the world works. So make sure you are finding references for all of these facts that you're going to be stating. Think hard about logical flow of this introduction. Like I said, a big part of it is going from more general to specific. That should help give you some logical flow. But make sure that you're using sort of signpost words or signpost phrases. So, for example, if we were doing our study on how lighting and music influence memory, and we had a whole section about lighting first, if I use a sentence like, however, lighting is not the only factor that can influence memory. Another possible variable that could be important in understanding how we learn material is the sounds around us while we're doing that learning. For example, music being played. Now, this is not a great sentence or set of sentences. I'm just coming up with it off the top of my head. But notice, I am helping my reader understand we're about to change topics. We've been talking a whole lot about lighting, but the language I'm using is saying, but hang on, it's not just lighting that's important, so is music. By saying that, I, as the reader, I'm like, okay, I got it. When the next paragraph starts talking about music, I'll understand why. It's not coming from nowhere. That's helping to give more logical flow to my paper, right? Use your own words to help your reader draw the conclusions you want them to draw from previous research and to guide them to your particular research theories and your research predictions. Speaking of which, that end of your introduction, those last few paragraphs are going to be similar across different people's papers. Your introduction should end with a broad theory of how your research variables work in the world. Here, I'm just making up a study. None of this is real. But for example, based on the pet interaction study of Smith, 2023, and the grooming research conducted by Jones, 2024, I believe that making physical contact with cats is generally an anxiety-reducing activity for most people. Okay, notice, I am making reference to a paper by Smith and a paper by Jones. Those are clearly papers that I would have previously talked about in an earlier section of my introduction. I'm bringing them up again here because those are probably two of the most important papers for drawing whatever theories I have about the way the world works when it comes to physical contact with cats and anxiety reduction. Right? So you kind of reference something that you already talked about, but you touch on it very lightly. Also, notice I am not talking about specifics of a study. Right now, I'm saying this is how I think the world works. Remember, we include a broad theory of how the world works, and then specific predictions about how, or hypotheses about how our experiment is going to go. And our experiment is supposed to test our broad theory of how the world works. So here's my broad theory. Something about making physical contact with cats in general is anxiety reducing. Next, we'll need to say something like, to test this theory, and give a brief description of your experiment. Notice the section right after the intro is the method section, and your method section is going to give your whole procedure. So here, you just need a very brief description, just enough for your predictions to make sense. So for example, following up with the same idea I had in my last point, to test this theory, participants either petted a live cat or a stuffed animal cat for 5 minutes, then completed the HAM-A anxiety scale. Notice, this is a very brief description of my experiment. It's really just giving enough information for someone to understand the predictions that are to come, because my predictions are going to be specific to my research methodology. So if I jump, let's go to them, right? Finally, your introduction ends with specific predictions for the outcome of your experiment. I predicted that participants petting the live cat would have lower scores on the anxiety questionnaire than with those who petted the stuffed animal cat. Notice, if I skipped, I'm going to go back a second. If I skipped this part where I say, to test this theory, here's the thing they're going to do. If I jumped straight to my predictions or my hypotheses, Lower scores on what anxiety questionnaire? What is that about? Well, I just told you here. To get in a measure of whether touching cats lowers anxiety, I'm going to give people an anxiety questionnaire. And I apparently named it, right? And I'm going to have them pet a cat, either a live cat or a stuffed cat. My method section will give a lot more information about who is this live cat? What about people who have allergies? What is the ham-A anxiety scale? Like, we'll get to that. But in your introduction, you really just need to give that little brief description so that your specific research predictions will make sense. The hope here is that as a reader, they will see what your theory is. They will see your very brief plan of how to test that theory, and they will see your predictions for your particular experiment and say, oh yeah, this is a logical way of testing the theory, right? If the world works in a way that for most people, touching a cat lowers anxiety, then having people pet a cat and giving them a questionnaire about anxiety, we should see that those who petted a real cat have lower anxiety than those just touching a stuffed animal. At least there's some logic to your methodology and some logic to your predictions. So that's why we always give both a broad theory of how we think the research works or research variables work in the real world, as well as those specific predictions for our research outcome. And we mention, and here's how we're going to do an experiment, right? I think one of the trickiest parts of an introduction, and maybe the place where I see the most errors in early papers, like if you haven't written these papers a bunch, is you need to have a very balanced introduction. You need to have solid and thorough coverage over all parts of your study design, which means all of the variables you're choosing to study. A really common problem is to have pretty good coverage for one variable, but then weaker coverage for another variable. For example, in my made-up study of looking at the impact of lighting and music on memory, right? It's really common for somebody to do a pretty good job of covering, like, what do we know about memory? Why are we interested in memory? Why does it matter what kinds of things could impact our ability to learn new things and remember them? Usually people do a good job covering that because that's the reason they're even doing the study. And then they might do a good job covering one of those variables. Maybe they found a lot of research and they're really excited on this lighting piece and the color of lighting and the brightness of lighting and the difference of indoor versus outdoor lighting. And they have a bunch of research on lighting. And then it just kind of peters out. Like they only have one or two studies maybe on our other variable of music, right? That is very common to have that good coverage for one or some of the variables, but sort of weak coverage for another variable. Yeah, you can't do that. Every variable you're telling us, this is a key component of my study, you need to have a thorough and solid coverage of what we already know about that. And if what you're telling the reader is, we don't have research on this topic yet, make sure you're explicit. Like actually say that. Don't just skip over it, because then I, as the reader, am going to assume you just didn't do your job of finding the research. If there truly isn't any, you have to tell me there isn't. And you're still going to go have to find something to tell me about, right? To see if this is a problem, this is why I say it's a really good idea to outline or do a draft of like early on in the process. And we make you do this, right? Like we're making you submit drafts and things like that. Well, part of that is so that you can identify well before the final paper is due, oh my gosh, I really haven't found very much previous research on one section of my study, right? I'm missing previous research for one of my variables, or I've only found one paper on it, something like that. Use that outline in particular. I know outlines aren't everybody's cup of tea. I love an outline for an introduction because it lets me sort all this previous research. And often what I find is, oh shoot, I found a whole bunch of previous research on the part of my study I'm most excited about because I read a whole lot about that. But there's some other part of my study I just haven't really found much on. And it makes me go read more into that section, right? If we wouldn't draw conclusions about how people in general work from a single case study, and we usually don't, then we also shouldn't draw conclusions from a single study finding that this is the way the world must work, just because one research team found evidence one time of one thing, especially when other work has been conducted. So if you're telling me I want to study the effects of music on studying, and you only gave me one study, I would say this is kind of like just doing a case study. How do we know that this is a general pattern versus a one-time blip of findings? Especially because I know we have lots of studies looking at the relationship between music and cognitive ability and memory and learning and performance on a test. Like, this is a widely established area. So I'm going to want a thorough coverage of it. This is tricky if you're studying something that there haven't been a lot of studies on in the past. For example, if you were studying the use of a particular very new AI tool for creating a resume, and you want to, I don't know, for some reason you're doing research on that. I could see someone saying, well, look, there's not a whole lot of research on this because this tool is only a few months old. So we wouldn't have had time to study it. Fair enough. Say exactly that in your paper. That's smart to point out this is very new. But you're still going to want to tell us why it's important and what kind of related stuff have we studied. We might not have had that particular tool, but there have been other tools for creating a resume. What previous research on these other sort of related tools do we have? And also, why do you think it might work differently with this new thing that you're studying? So just saying, oh, there's no research on this, that's not good enough. You're just going to have to go sort of further afield to say, there's no research on this, but there's this other thing that's kind of related, and here's a pattern we've seen. However, it's not exactly the same thing, so we're a little more open to who knows where this is going to go. Like, that's very reasonable. But you still have to give us some argument for why it's important to study and maybe what, like I said, further afield research has said and how that could influence the predictions that you're going to make for your own study.